Hi, this is Jane with Green Side Up. Today we're going to talk about orchids. Now, I did a little research and oh my goodness, there's so much to learn about orchids. We're not going to talk about all of it. In fact, just a little itty bit. Orchids belong to a family called Orchidaceae. I think that's maybe how you say it. And it is one of the two largest families of flowering plants. You can see some here behind me. All orchids are perennials, but they lack a woody structure. In fact, in the wild, orchids hang onto, for instance, a tree, to the bark of a tree. They hang onto the tree with their roots. Now, they are not getting nutrients from the tree, but that's just how they're clinging onto it. That's how they grow. The roots will actually bring in the nutrients. Often in the wild, when it rains, the tree will have water running down it, and the roots will be able to get some of the nutrients that are running down the tree. I mentioned the roots hanging onto the tree bark. So this is some of the aerial roots, they're called, that is on an orchid. And it's these roots that would hang onto the bark. In a pot, obviously, they're not hanging onto the bark, but often those roots will come out. And for instance, if I was to repot this, as I will discuss later, I would use a pot that has holes in it, like this, so those roots can actually come out and be aerial roots. So I told you that there's lots of different kinds of orchids. Here's just a little fact I read about. Did you know that vanilla flavoring, like what you put in, baked goods, vanilla flavoring, comes from the orchid family? And in fact, the flat-leafed vanilla orchid is native to Mexico, to Belize, and it is the only orchid that is used for, they say, industrial purposes. In other words, for food, for flavoring, for those nice candles sometimes that you smell. All of that comes from the orchid plant. Some people don't get orchids because they've heard that they're very hard to take care of, very hard to grow. Well, I guess that could be the case with any kind of plant. If you know a few basic facts, you'll be able to grow orchids at your house. The main type of cultivar, the main type of orchid that you buy in the store is a Phalaenopsis. That's the kind of orchid that it is. So that's sort of where I'm aiming at. There's, like I said, a whole bunch of different kinds, and I'm not even going to talk about them. Most of them I can't even pronounce. So the first thing you're going to do is take your orchid home from the store. Because an orchid has a long stem, you are going to want to be very careful that you don't break it in the transportation home. So just make sure that after you've bought your orchid, that you have a secure place to carry it all the way home. Once you get it home, you're going to want to put it in, of course, just the right light. Now, an orchid in the wild is growing in kind of a shaded area. So you're not going to want to put it in the brightest window of your house. For instance, an east window would probably be good, especially if that east window probably has a little shade to it. Now, how you grow a plant, any plant, in the summer versus the winter is going to be a little bit different. In the summertime, there's lots of light. In the wintertime, there's just not as much. So a window that works in the wintertime may not work as well in the summer. So anyway, an orchid needs muted light, I guess would be the way, but not complete shade. The next question people have is, how do I water my orchid? Now, I've done some reading, and there's different ways that they talk about. One of the methods that people say is, you just use ice cubes. Well, probably not. Because an orchid doesn't want that real cold water. Remember, it grows in a hot, humid place. An ice cube is pretty chilly. So what they recommend is taking your orchid plant, taking it over to your kitchen sink, and putting some lukewarm water on it for probably about 15 seconds. 15 seconds isn't very long. That way you've moistened the whole plant. Then you let it drain. You never want a plant to sit in water, orchids or any other kind of plant. So you're going to let it drain at the sink for probably an hour or so. Get all those drips out. Then you can put it back in its place. There is one thing that is recommended. Orchids like humidity. How do you get humidity? One easy way is to take a saucer, a container, put some rocks on it, or marbles. Put some water so it's below the rock line, below the top of that rock. And then you can just set your orchid plant on top of that. What that will do, it isn't going to water the orchid, but what it does is it allows humidity to come up off of those rocks, and that will make your orchid and some of your other types of plants very happy. After you've gotten your orchid plant, you may notice that the pot that it's in is kind of deformed. If you notice on this one, it is starting to bulge. Orchids will bloom when they're kind of root bound. They like to be a little bit tight. But there will come a point where you will need to transplant your orchid. So when you're going to do that, remember they have the aerial roots. They get their nutrients from the roots. So you're going to want to make sure that those roots are showing. You're not going to want to cover them. Orchids are not planted into dirt, into soil. They're planted into a different type of medium. And that's what we're going to talk about. When you transplant your orchid, you can use a pot that has holes on the side. See this? Now you wouldn't put any other kinds of plants in this because the dirt would fall out. But with an orchid, you want those roots to be coming out. The kind of soil medium, I guess, that you would use for an orchid is you can either use a mix which has moss, or you can do a bark chip, or you can do a combination. The moss will retain fluids a little bit better, so it's going to take a little bit longer for that moss to dry out. That will affect how often you water. So for instance, whereas with the moss you might only water, maybe every week, if you use a different type of medium, like a bark chip you might water every, say, 6 days. How often you water your plants, any kind of plants, depends on how warm your house is, how much sun you're getting, the kind of plants you have, the kind of soil they have. There's just all kinds of things that will affect how often you water. So anyway, on orchids, as a rule, you're going to water them about once a week, again, at your sink with warm water. And you're going to let them drain. Just remember that when you're repotting, you want to make sure that those orchid roots can come out. Another question that people might have is, after the flowers are done blooming, what do you do with this stem? Do you cut it off? Do you leave it? What do you do with it? There's two ways that you can do it. Either one is probably right. One is you can cut it back, say like part ways. You're still leaving some nodes on it. You can cut it so that you have some of the stem showing, or you can cut it all the way back. Either way, you're still going to get a new stem in a few months. Orchids will bloom in the wintertime. It generally will take them 6 to 9 months to get ready to rebloom. As with any plants, orchids enjoy being fed a little bit. There's different types of orchid foods that you can use. Always follow the directions on the package. Orchids don't need to be fed a lot, but they do need to be fed some. And depending on where they are in their bloom cycle, will depend on how often you feed them and how much. Orchids are relatively pest-free, but as with any kind of plant, they can get diseases or they can get bugs. The bugs that can bug them are aphids, mealybugs, just kind of your typical bugs that bug all kinds of houseplants. If you see bugs on your plant, first of all, of course, remove the plant from any other plants so that you don't contaminate everybody else. You can treat it with an insecticidal soap. The other type of things that they can get would be like a fungus, little types of molds. And so again, with a fungus, you would treat them with a fungicide. If they get a bacterial disease, there's not much you can do. And that's often the case with a lot of plants. In bacterial diseases, they're just not a good thing to have. hopefully you won't get any of those kind of problems. As with any kind of plants, always you want to just check to make sure that your plant is healthy. And if you see something on it, remove it immediately so that you don't contaminate anything else. I found out that orchids are safe around children and around pets. And in fact, the orchid flower is edible. This is Jane with Green Side Up. I hope you have learned something about orchids. I have in doing the video. If you have any comments, you may leave them in the comment section. And I hope to see you back with another video shortly.